All right, everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today we're tackling global performance management. How do we design and implement these systems to work across borders and cultures?
Super relevant topic these days, right?
Absolutely. And to guide our exploration, we're turning to a fantastic article from Business Horizons titled Performance Management Universals: Think Globally and Act Locally.
Oh, yeah, I know this one. It's by Herman Aguinis,
Guinness, yep.
Harry Jew, and Ryan Gottfredson.
Exactly.
Good stuff.
So essentially, they're arguing that to really make performance management work globally, we need to find that sweet spot between universal principles and cultural awareness.
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure.
Okay, a balancing act, got it.
Yeah.
But before we jump into all the details, why is this global perspective so crucial? Like, why should we care about getting this right?
Well, think about it. Performance management is kind of the backbone of almost every organization.
Right, because individual performance ultimately fuels organizational success, right?
Exactly. But it gets tricky when you factor in cultural differences.
Because those differences can really impact how those systems are designed, how they're used, and how well they actually work, right?
Right on.
Okay, so it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation. Can you give us like a real-world example of how those cultural differences actually play out?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let's look at India for a sec. Traditional Indian values, they often emphasize like a more paternalistic leadership style.
Interesting.
And this can actually clash with systems that are pushing supervisors to be more like, coaches or mentors rather than the ultimate authority figure.
Ah, so you've got this tension between those traditional expectations and these newer approaches to management.
Totally. And that's just one example.
Wow, okay. So how do we even begin to navigate these potential clashes? I know the article lays out 5 universal principles for effective performance management. Are those kind of like our foundational building blocks?
Yeah, you could think of them that way. It all starts with aligning job descriptions with organizational goals.
Okay, that makes sense.
Sounds basic, but trust me, you'd be surprised how often things get misaligned.
Yeah, especially when you've got teams scattered all over the globe.
Exactly. Everyone needs to be rowing in the same direction, even if they're in different boats, so to speak.
I like that analogy.
So yeah, alignment is key.
Perfect. So what's the next universal principle?
Training.
Ah, okay.
And not just training for the employees being evaluated, but also super important for the people doing the evaluating.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Got to make sure everyone's on the same page, using the same criteria,
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with different cultural norms and expectations around feedback.
Yeah, that consistency is key for fair evaluations across the board.
Absolutely. Okay, so principle number 3 emphasizes measuring both behaviors and results.
Ooh, interesting.
And this applies to individuals and teams. A really solid performance management system doesn't just look at what you achieve, it also digs into how you achieve it.
Ah, so it's not just about hitting those targets, but how you get there, right? Ethical considerations and all that.
Exactly.
I like that. Okay, what's next?
Principle number 4, a strengths-based approach to feedback.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
So instead of dwelling on an employee's weaknesses or areas for improvement, you flip the script. You zero in on what they excel at, what their strengths are, and then figure out how to leverage those strengths even more.
So, ditch the negativity and focus on amplifying the positives.
Right. It's a more empowering approach, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Does this approach actually have a measurable impact, though? I mean, does it really make a difference?
Oh, yeah. Tons of research on this. A strengths-based approach has been linked to higher employee engagement,
Okay.
better productivity, and even better retention rates.
Wow, so it's win-win-win, really.
Pretty much. It's a good one.
I love it. Okay, on to our final universal principle. What is it?
Meaningful rewards. This one's crucial.
Of course, got to have the rewards.
Right. Whether it's a bonus, a promotion, or even just some really heartfelt recognition, those rewards have to actually matter to the employee. And what motivates someone in, say, Japan might be totally different from what motivates someone in Brazil.
Ah, right. Cultural context matters big time.
It really does.
Okay, so we've got our 5 universal building blocks in place, but I have a feeling this is where the act locally part comes in, right?
Yeah.
How do we actually apply these principles while respecting all those cultural differences?
That's where it gets interesting. So the authors, they highlight 5 cultural dimensions that can really influence how those universals get applied in practice. They're like lenses, through which we view those principles.
Ooh, okay, I'm intrigued. What's the first dimension?
Individualism versus collectivism.
Okay.
Does the culture prioritize individual achievement or group harmony? This impacts everything from performance evaluation to how you distribute rewards.
Ah, I see. So in a highly individualistic culture like, say, the US, you might see an emphasis on those individual bonuses. Whereas in a more collectivist culture like Japan, the focus might shift toward team rewards or more collective recognition, right?
Exactly, you got it. And then there's power distance,
Which
which
basically looks at how comfortable people are with unequal power distribution.
Right.
In high power distance cultures, like, feedback usually comes mainly from the supervisor because that reflects that hierarchical structure.
So it's about respecting those established lines of authority.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, next up we've got uncertainty avoidance.
Okay.
This one explores how much people crave structure and clarity. Cultures with high uncertainty avoidance, they really need super specific job descriptions, very clear expectations.
So they know exactly what's expected of them.
Yep, and they want really well-defined reward systems too. No surprises.
makes sense.
All right, what other dimensions do we need to consider?
Well, there's masculinity versus femininity. This one dives into how distinct gender roles are within a given culture.
Okay.
And that can impact everything from training styles to communication approaches.
Right, so in a culture with more fluid gender roles, you might see more collaborative training approaches or less emphasis on really rigid hierarchies.
Exactly. Spot on. And then finally, we have fatalism versus self-determinism.
Ooh, that's a fascinating one.
Right. This dimension digs into whether people believe they have control over their own outcomes or if they feel like their fate is already predetermined.
Wow, that's pretty deep. How does that play out in performance management?
Well, if you're dealing with a culture that leans more towards fatalism, you might focus more on measuring behaviors rather than outcomes because, those individuals may not feel like they have as much control over those final results.
Ah, that's such an interesting nuance. Okay, so we've got these 5 universal principles and then these 5 cultural dimensions. And I'm starting to see how complex this whole global puzzle really is.
Yeah, it's a lot to juggle, but that's what makes it so interesting, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This has been so insightful already. I'm really starting to grasp how much thought and care needs to go into creating performance management systems that actually work on a global scale.
Totally.
So how do we actually put all of this together in the real world? Like, how do we move from theory to practice?
Well, the article provides some awesome examples of how this think globally, act locally approach plays out in specific situations.
Okay, perfect. I'm definitely ready to hear about those. Let's dive in.
All right, so let's jump into those real-world examples, shall we?
Yes, please.
Let's imagine for a sec, you're designing a performance management system, but for a team based in Japan.
Okay.
And Japan, as we know, is a culture known for high uncertainty avoidance.
Right. They really value clarity and structure.
Exactly. So remember how we talked about those detailed job descriptions?
Oh, yeah, those are super important in this context.
Absolutely. So instead of just listing those general responsibilities, you'd actually need to outline those tasks in detail.
Right, get really specific.
Yeah, even potential challenges, that they might encounter, almost like you're creating a roadmap for them.
Ah, I see. So they have this clear path to follow with those milestones along the way.
Exactly. And that helps them feel more comfortable, more secure, especially in a culture that really values predictability.
Right, right. It takes away that ambiguity and guesswork.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
Let's say you're implementing a feedback system, but this time it's in Malaysia.
Right.
And Malaysia, that's a high-power distance culture.
Right. So those hierarchical structures are really important.
Exactly. So how would you approach that feedback system?
Well, we've talked about how feedback from supervisors carries a lot more weight in those types of cultures.
Yep.
So I'm thinking maybe you'd have a system where, like, the primary source of feedback comes from the supervisor.
Okay, I like that.
But then you also try to incorporate peer feedback in a way that's still respectful of those hierarchical norms.
That's a really good point. Maybe the supervisor actually solicits feedback from peers,
Ah, okay.
but then they deliver it themselves, kind of filtering it through that lens of authority.
That's an interesting way to balance things out.
Right. It's not about completely eliminating peer feedback. It's more about recognizing that, feedback from the supervisor just holds a different level of importance in this cultural context.
Right. It's about finding that balance again, isn't it? Incorporating diverse perspectives, but doing it in a way that's culturally sensitive.
Exactly. You're getting it. Okay, ready for one more example?
Hit me with it.
All right. This time, we're tackling rewards in a collectivist culture. Let's say Ecuador.
Okay, Ecuador.
So group harmony, fairness, those are huge in Ecuadorian culture.
Right.
How would you design a reward system that really clicks with those values?
Well, individual bonuses are probably not the best idea, right?
Probably not.
Maybe you'd focus more on team-based incentives.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
Or maybe even recognition programs that really highlight that shared success.
Perfect, like a profit-sharing program or rewarding the teams as a whole when they hit those targets.
Right.
It's about understanding that in these collectivist cultures, it's not always about the individual.
Yeah.
It's more about that collective good, that sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself.
Wow, these examples are so helpful. They really highlight just how much we need to consider those cultural nuances. It's like this global puzzle.
It is a puzzle, but it's a fun one to solve, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So, am I on the right track here? The big takeaway is that successfully managing performance on a global scale isn't about forcing everyone to conform to the same rigid system.
Right, nailed it. It's all about understanding those universal principles, those building blocks, but then being willing to adapt them.
Right, to fit those specific cultural contexts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like finding that sweet spot where those global principles and those local nuances intersect.
And that creates a system that actually resonates with people.
Yeah, no matter where they are in the world, it's about making everyone feel valued and respected.
I love it. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground, explored all those universal principles and cultural dimensions, but I'm really curious to hear about those practical tips. How do we actually navigate these complexities and put all of this knowledge into action?
Totally. Well, first off, I think a great starting point is to invest in some cultural sensitivity training.
Okay, makes sense.
For yourself, for your team.
So it's not just about reading books or articles, it's about that actual structured learning.
Right. Because that can help us challenge those unconscious biases we all have.
Right, right.
And it can provide us with a framework for really understanding those cultural differences.
I like it. And beyond that formal training, is there anything else we can do?
Oh, yeah. I think creating a space for open dialogue is huge. Encouraging that active listening, making sure that everyone feels comfortable sharing their perspective.
Especially when those perspectives might be different from the norm.
Exactly. Those are sometimes the most valuable conversations to have, even if they're a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree. So it's really about moving beyond just acquiring knowledge
Yeah.
and actually putting it into practice, right?
100%. That's where the real magic happens.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? Like, what are some concrete steps we can take?
Well, I think being mindful of those cultural nuances in your everyday interactions is a great place to start.
Okay, can you give us an example?
Yeah, think about communication styles. You know how some cultures are very direct with feedback,
Right.
while others prefer a more subtle approach?
Yeah.
Being aware of those differences and, adjusting your communication style accordingly, that can go a long way.
So it's about making sure your message is actually received in the way you intended it.
Exactly. It takes effort, for sure.
It does. But it's worth it, right?
Totally. Because ultimately it's about showing respect.
Right, respect for those different cultural values.
And making people feel comfortable, understood.
It's interesting because it seems like one of the biggest mistakes we can make is assuming that everyone wants to be treated the same way.
Oh, that's a huge one. And that's where those cultural dimensions come in.
Right.
Because what might motivate someone in one culture might totally demotivate someone in another.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we got to move away from that one-size-fits-all mentality.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that individuality, right?
Yeah.
Within that broader global framework.
You got it. And that takes constant learning, being open to feedback, challenging our own assumptions.
Always be learning. This has been such an insightful deep dive. We've covered so much. From those 5 universal principles to those cultural dimensions that shape how we apply them, it's clear that designing and implementing global performance management systems, it takes real thought, real care.
It does, but it's so rewarding when you get it right.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, is there one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think it all boils down to this: don't underestimate the power of cultural understanding.
Okay.
It's not just a nice to have. It's crucial for creating performance management systems that are fair, effective, and that genuinely resonate with a global workforce.
So it's about going beyond those checklists and those generic policies and really understanding those values.
Exactly. And the unique perspectives of our colleagues all over the world.
Beautifully said.
Thanks.
And on that note, we've reached the end of another deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.